What is up, everybody? Josh Tapp here again, and welcome back to The Lucky Titan. And today we're here with Carlos Hidalgo. And this is an interview I've been looking forward to because Carlos and I have had some scheduling issues. We've had to go back and forth, but I wanted to make this one happen because Carlos has a really awesome entrepreneurial history, a corporate history, and he's been in the marketing space for 15 years. Is that correct, Carlos? 15 years?
The agency space for 15 years. I've been in marketing for 25. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's been in marketing for 25 years. So he has great tips and tactics. But what's been cool is to watch that he's come into kind of more of a coaching role and helping people structure their lifestyle, build their lifestyle. And so I really wanted to talk about that today because a lot of you have been mentioning to me that you're having a hard time determining how much you should work and kind of that work-life balance, which never seems to actually exist. So I'm excited to talk through a lot of that with you today, Carlos. So first off, Carlos, say what's up to everybody and we'll hop in.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Josh, for having me on the show. Glad we could get this scheduled and so thrilled to be here with you and your audience.
I'm appreciative of it. I really am excited for this one. So Carlos, the first thing I want to ask you is what was kind of that pivotal moment for you that took you from marketing, from being 25 years of marketing to saying, I want to help people with their lifestyle? What was that pivotal moment for you?
Yeah, for me, it was getting back to what I was put on earth to do, rediscovering my purpose, which started with getting back to who I was created to be, my identity. And that came through 12 years of pursuing huge growth in my agency. I was pedal to the metal. I bought into the hustle garbage that's out there, that mentality, that grind. And honestly, it cost me dearly. It cost me my family, almost cost me my marriage. And in 2016, my wife and I separated for 9 months. We didn't think we were going to make it. My kids, who were now teenagers, were kind of like, oh, so now you want to be involved in my life. What's all that about? And I had to really dig myself out of a pit. And it was through that dark night of the soul moment where I realized, you know what? I'm not living out who I was created to be. I'm not living out my purpose, which is helping people. So I wrote a book about it called the UnAmerican Dream, which came out 2 years ago. And then people started saying to me, hey, I relate to this. Can you coach me through this? And it never occurred to me to be a coach, but it was through all of that that brought me to the place where I love to help people create the life they love to live every day.
I love that. And that's brilliant because I love to hear the stories of how that transition happens because there's always a big, ugly background to these beautiful, amazing lifestyles that we see. And it's so interesting to hear these, especially as the host, hear how you were able to transition. And I bet there's 15 different stories you could share with us about what happened from being separated to getting back together. And now, I mean, you're in business with your wife, and that means your relationship is pretty strong if you've gotten to that point. So I appreciate your story there.
Yeah, we have a great relationship. We work really hard at it, and we're having a blast being together. We talk about being in our second marriage to the same but two very different people.
And people are like, wait, what? Polygamous?
Yeah, not quite.
Well, I appreciate that story. So, Carlos, I want to ask you this, especially as somebody who's been in marketing for 25 years. How have you launched the Carlos and Suzanne company, with coaching and consulting? Because a lot of the people listening to this are coaches, and they're saying, I want to branch into this market. I want to see some success. How did you do that, especially with something like lifestyle where everybody knows they need it, but nobody ever buys it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. First of all, we just started to say, what if we were going to teach what we went through? And again, I hope nobody goes through what we go through, but if we were going to teach the way we live now, what we embody now, which is what we call life design, what would that look like? So we developed a model that we could talk about that later, but then we started to say, who are we going after, right? And I talk to coaches who they go, well, everybody needs my service. The reality is that's not true. The reality is you got to identify who is your core audience for your service. And so we narrowed it down to couples, and we narrowed it down to executives. And when I talk about executives, I'm not talking like, oh, you have to be a vice president title, but professionals, especially in the sales and marketing arena, because I am one. I am still a marketer at heart. I am still a salesperson at heart. And then my wife works oftentimes with the workaholic or the person who is so off track from a life design perspective because she was on the other side. And so she understands that whole aspect. So we defined our audience. And then the real key is we've grown organically. We've not gone out and taken a bunch of Facebook ads and done a bunch of email blasts and things because we want people who want to be there. So we've settled for slower growth in order to get the right individual and get their commitment to what we're asking them to do, which is change.
Right. I mean, you're really inspiring a whole lifestyle shift because I know, and
Yes.
you explained this as your story, and I would say the same thing for me is it's pretty easy to feel like, oh, I've got to be doing everything if I want to hit multiple millions of dollars or become a billionaire. And that seems to be like everybody's goal in their mind is, oh, I want to become a billionaire, a multimillionaire, what have you. But it's been so intriguing for me to interview people like yourself who've been very successful. And most people will say, I hit $1 million and realized I didn't even need that much money. And so I backed down. I stopped working on that. And it's crazy to watch how many people decided to sacrifice a little bit of money, quote unquote. They're still making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but sacrificing a little bit of money so they can have way more time and have a better relationship with their family and their spouse, especially.
Yeah, 100%. When I coach, one of the questions I ask people is define success for me and then define what you value. I have yet to have someone say success is a dollar figure or I value a dollar figure. They talk about relationship. They talk about meaningful connection. They talk about community. They talk about an achievement, not in terms of a professional, but if I can get to this point in my life. And it's all about life design. Yet we absolutely pursue the golden ring of $1 million. I got to get my agency to $5 million. I've done the $5 million agency thing. And I arrived at the mountaintop and I realized this is it. This is what I crushed my, ground my soul to nothing to achieve this. It wasn't worth it. And so I'm not a millionaire. And you know what? If I never become a millionaire, I will still say I'm wildly successful, more so now than ever before in my career.
Right. I love that. That's why I consider you a Titan. So I want to ask you this, Carlos, with all of that being said, and coming back kind of to how you're coaching, consulting people on building an actual lifestyle and restructuring a lifestyle, I want to give you kind of a hypothetical, and let's work off of that hypothetical to kind of unravel your framework and see how your framework works. So I'm a coach who is coaching people on business. Let's just say I'm an executive coach. I'm making $750,000 a year. I've got 5 people on my team, and I'm working 60 to 70 hours a week pretty easily. So what would you start, or where would you start with me? And then how would you get me to where I was living my lifestyle that I liked?
Yeah, first of all, I would ask you what's important to you in terms of life. And you mentioned work-life balance, and I know I've written about it. I've also given a TEDx on it. I've arrived at the point where I think the whole thing is a fallacy. Number one, whoever created the term, the fact that work is first is ridiculous, right? We have life. That's what we have. We have 168 hours in a week to do with our life whatever we want to do. If we're working 60 to 70 hours, we're putting so much more of our time into work than anything else. So first of all, I would say, what is important to you and how do you define success? And then have you ever sat down and literally written out, what is those things that you value? And I'm not talking about cars and houses, but truly like independence, freedom, creativity, spirituality, those types of things. And then I would say, okay, if that's what you've written down and that's what you believe, if you have a partner, have them do the same thing. And where are you two aligned? Because if you're working 60 to 70 hours, somebody's paying the price on that. Are those values aligned with how you're living? If they are, awesome. Are they aligned with how you and your partner want to live? If they are, awesome. The reality is most times they're not. And so if we can then say, great, so how do we get back to those things that you designed or define that you value? How do we get back to that? And what I find most often is we have to get back to who we were created to be, our core identity as an individual. And so many times when we are young, we get pushed far off course, whether it's an event, something someone said to us, a parental issue, the way we were taught, etc., which then puts us on a path to pursue a false purpose. And so you may be raking, pulling down $7.5 million a year and still be super miserable and know there's a better way to live life.
Right. Well, and I have to ask this question, especially as I've been kind of stewing in the back of my mind this whole time is you look at people like Tony Robbins, for example, who, hyper successful. I think he's a billionaire now, billionaire coach, basically. And you look at him and it appears like he's got it all together, but he's also had some issues with his family or what have you, not to bash on him. That's
Hmm.
just kind of how it is. What about those people who say, I want part of my value system is I love my family. I want to be with my family, but I also want the recognition and the status and the things like that that come from becoming a billionaire, hyper successful. Like, where's the balance between that, and how do you still live that lifestyle?
Well, I think you have to come to terms with you're probably going to get there slower. It's not wrong to want those things, but if you're in a marriage, if you're in a partnership, there has to be the discussion of, hey, are we both on board with this? And if we are, what agreements are, so we're aligned, then what agreements are we going to put in place to get us there? So I coach one client right now where he has a line in the sand of 50 hours a week. And it's one of the things we talk about in each session is how are we doing with that 50 hours? That was his line in the sand, not mine. And so we talk about that thing. He's willing to go slower to get that growth than try to do pedal to the metal. But if we're not willing to have that conversation with our other half, then we're not sacrificing anything. We're just really selfish.
Right. Well, where do you think that comes from? I mean, that desire to have to work more, because it's almost like we feel like in order to achieve the success, because we're being told the hustle grind. I really don't like that because it feels like kind of more of a side gig thing, but it's the working 120-hour week so that you can stay on top of your workload. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, why do you think people actually feel like that's what it requires to become hyper successful?
Yeah, I think it's an addiction, first and foremost. And an addiction is used to cover up things that we don't want to necessarily deal with. And so work is a very convenient, I actually call it the noble addiction, because nobody's ever going to fault you for being a hard worker. So I think what's happened in our society and going back into the 80s, and I know this because when you write a book on this stuff, you start to do research on this. Going back into the 80s, where it was all about economic prosperity and the building of wealth, we adopted this idea that this was the American dream. Well, it's not. It's actually quite un-American. I'm a son of an immigrant. My father came from Cuba in 1960 and left a lifestyle of wealth. My grandfather was one of the richest men in Cuba and came here not knowing the language with a suitcase and built something now where, he's 76 years old and he's had a wildly successful business. But he didn't kill himself there was a while there where he did, but he's even started to see the light. And so I think that's this idea that if we're not working, we're not valuable. If we're not working, we're not contributing. And there's also a psychology perspective. We want to be seen as the most valuable resource. So if I'm not there, if I'm not showing up, or if I'm not doing this, life won't go on without me. My business won't continue. And that's just not true. So there's a lot of psychology that goes into why we feel we need to do the things we do, when in reality, anything north of, I think it's 47 hours, we actually reach a law of diminishing returns and start to work dumber, not harder.
Yeah. I recently heard there was a study that it's a direct correlation to people who die before 85 and people who work 50 hours a week, or more than 50 hours a
Yes,
week. I thought that was really
that's correct.
interesting to hear that study. And coming back to where you're at with the Un-American Dream, I love that title. First off, I want to hear what your perspective is on the American Dream. I have a pretty staunch opinion on the American Dream, so I'm kind of curious to hear what yours is.
Well, I'm going to go back to what James Truslow Adams coined when he coined the term in 1931. He talked about it being a way of life where we get to pursue and have opportunity afforded to all of us. And he actually says, now keep in mind it was 1931, he says it's not the amount of motor cars that we have. So he's talking about it's not measured by material possession. The American dream is having opportunity to go and pursue that which we want, which is why we've kind of modeled our coaching practice to say once we identify who, the identity, then we can identify our why. We align that with our gifts and talents, and then the opportunities are immense. to go out and do whatever we want in this world. And I would say once I started to switch the paradigm from saying it's all about how many hours I work, how big my agency becomes, the paycheck I bring home, to now I'm going to go fulfill my purpose. I will say my agency is more profitable than it's ever been. I make more money than I've ever made. That's not been my goal. It's not my motivator. And I am right now the most successful I've ever been in my career. And I'm as happy as I've ever been in my life because I choose to be. And on top of all of that, I just 2 weeks ago went to a full-time 4-day work week.
Awesome.
So I'm working less.
That is brilliant. Well, you didn't say anything I don't agree with. I love the fact that you pointed that out, because I think it's so interesting, especially when people talk about entrepreneurship and that they talk about the risk, and there's kind of this pro or con, if that makes sense. Like people who are black or white on it, where they say, I'm 100% into entrepreneurship, which I am. And then you have the people who are like, entrepreneurship is scary, that's risky, you shouldn't do it. And what's interesting to me is what you just talked about, is it's not about the material gain of it. It's the opportunity to have opportunities, and that creative ability that you're able to share with the world, and the value you can provide to the world, the problems you can solve. So I love that you talked about that. You touched on that point. And so your book is really written all around that, and helping people understand how to live the American dream. Is that correct?
It is. And a lot of it is my own story of just all the things I pursued, from a false identity to, how I was, I was walking around and demanding the nicest hotels, wearing suits and cufflinks and all. And not that there's anything wrong with that. It was wrong for me because that's not who I am.
Right.
And so I talk about all of those things. And then my wife has a really poignant chapter in the middle of the book, which for my money is the best chapter, where she talked about what it was like to be on the other side of somebody who was just hell bent on growth and everything else took a back seat. So that's what the book is really about.
That is brilliant. Well, I'm gonna have to go pick up a copy of that. So everybody, make sure you go get a copy of that. He's not even really here to promote the book, but go make sure you go check that out.
Yeah, no.
Well, and Carlos, I want to ask you, we're coming to the end of the interview here, and I want to ask you a couple questions just to kind of wrap this up.
Sure.
So the first one is, where can people gain access to you and Suzanne?
Yeah, just go to our website, carlosandsuzanne.com, and that's SUSANNE.com. You can find information about the book, our coaching, speaking, etc. It's probably the best way to get in touch with us.
Awesome. So it's carlosandsuzanne.com. Everybody, that will be provided in the show notes. You'll be able to see those. But I want to ask you one final thing, Carlos, just before we wrap this up. So if you could leave us with one final parting piece of guidance, what would that be?
I would say that life is far too short to spend it in an office or spend it away from your families or your relationships. We as human beings are designed and wired for deep, meaningful connection. And we will not find that in our work. Will not find that on our social media platforms, and certainly not on our phones. So start to rethink about the way you're living. And if you have an inkling that life could be better, let's set up a time to talk. I'm not here to pitch you. I'm just here to help guide you.